So thank you first to my previous colleagues who spoke and to those who come after, and for this opportunity. I'd like to take a slightly different approach, which is the premise of this is that there are double standards when it comes to genocide. And I think we should first acknowledge that there is a very strong double standard going on right now, contemporaneous to what's happening in Gaza, which is what's going on with Ukraine and the Western and particularly American support for the efforts in Ukraine to fight against an aggressive power, a power that has taken over and annexed territory, and that is committing war crimes and possibly worse in Ukraine. And compare that to what's happening in Palestine, not just Gaza, but all over Palestine. That's a clear double standard. But when it comes to the issue of genocide, I think that we have a different issue at hand, which is not one of double standard, but actually one of consistency. And if we go back more than now, I guess 30 years or so, when we look at the Rwanda genocide, when there were clear warnings issued to the West, and we saw complete inaction until it was too late. When we've seen other such places, such as Darfur, about 20 years ago, where there were clear warnings in place, and there was a complete lack of interest and concern until it was too late. And as we've just seen under this current Biden administration and the previous Trump administration together, we've seen potential genocide and certainly genocidal acts, and seems to be incitement to a genocide in Ethiopia, Tigray. We've seen it in just a few weeks before what happened in Gaza, in Artsakh, between the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians. The permission to commit genocide exists in the international system despite international law. And as Mr. McCarthy indicated, we do really have to question if international law, if international humanitarian law is anything more than words on paper at this point, not only because of the permission that we've seen given to actors to commit genocide, but also the tools that have been set up to investigate and prosecute through the ICC have been rendered almost completely meaningless, except in the most sort of colonial approaches towards prosecuting weak or particularly those countries in Africa and the global South, as opposed to with the notable exception recently of Vladimir Putin in Russia. But that's again fitting certain Western interests to do that. I would also say that in terms of Palestinian experience, what we are seeing here is also not an exception. The encirclement of Gaza City by Israel echoes back to the 1982 encirclement of Beirut, when at the time the PLO was effectively the way Israel portrays Hamas today in many ways. And as a result, at that time, the solution that the Americans helped foster was to evacuate the PLO from Lebanon and take all of the fighters out and remove them and take them to another place. And many held that at the moment as a potentially useful thing for the Americans to do. However, 1 month after the PLO was taken out of Lebanon or taken out of Beirut, the Sabra and Shatila massacre occurred as the Israelis allowed and facilitated Phalangist militias to come in and massacre Palestinians. I'd also like to just throw out there that from my perspective, at least, and this is my personal perspective, what we are witnessing in Palestine is not, Mr. Moran indicated that it's another Nakba. What I would actually suggest is that, and Palestinians have said, is that this is actually an ongoing Nakba. And as such, it's an ongoing genocide for 75 years. And what we have today is a spike in violence, for sure. But at the same time, this spike in violence is happening in Gaza in the way it is. Just a few days ago, in the village of Wadi Asir, 200 Palestinians were expelled from their village in the West Bank on foot, leaving only with their goats and other animals and their children and carrying what they could on their backs. And this is not the only incident in the West Bank. I think more than 2,000 people at this point have been forcibly forced to leave their homes and villages in the West Bank, which is a rising number of Palestinians in the West Bank being forced. This is a 75-year process, and I think one of the best ways to understand it is that it's a settler colonial effort to take over as much land as possible with as few people as possible. And as such, we need to understand it both in terms of genocide and in terms of settler colonialism in order to be able to come up with practical, effective solutions to this. I would just add that in the case with Israel, unlike many of the other instances from history, the United States primarily and other countries in the West not only have no interest in helping, they also seem intent on encouraging and supporting, as you indicated, through the provision of weaponry and other financial aid that enables all of this to happen.